Hey, welcome. And you are watching the inaugural edition of Think Tank Thursday. So this is a new thing that we're trying here at Luminex. We're going to experiment with it. But if you're watching this, you probably know us by Whiteboard Wednesday. And we're going to keep doing those. They're 3 to 5 minute video-based equipping, just little snippets that help you as a leader, help your church or ministry. Think Tank Thursday is going to be similar, except it's conversational, and we're going to wander a little bit. And so again, we're going to experiment. We're obviously doing this during the time of coronavirus, which is why we're on Zoom instead of a whiteboard in a room somewhere. So thanks for bearing with us. Here's what we'd love for you to do. Again, if you're watching this, give us some feedback, because we have no idea how this is going to go. So what did you like? What did you not like? What can we do better? If you did like it, would you hit like or maybe follow on Luminex? What topics would you love for us to address? If you have the name of a person, maybe even yourself, who you think would be a great guest on one of these, let us know, because we don't want it to always just be the three of us. We want to bring some other people in that will make it so much better. So please help us to help serve you. So for today, our topic is strategy as it relates specifically to churches. And we're going to think about 3 questions. This conversation is going to wander a little bit, and that's okay. But 3 questions to ground us. The first one is simply, in a church context, what do we mean by strategy? What is it? What is it not? Secondly, where does strategy fit in a broader framework? And then thirdly, what best practices have we seen relating to strategy in a church context? So John Messer, Scott Lokers, we are the core team at Luminex. And again, I know on behalf of all of us, we want to say thanks for joining us. And let's just kick it off with the first question. What do we mean by strategy in a church context?
My simple definition of strategy has always been strategy is really getting from here to there. I think that strategy is the process, the tactics that we incorporate to get from where we are now to where we believe we're supposed to be. In other words, the vision. So it's connecting current reality with our vision. And that may be oversimplistic, but it helps me to remember that there's movement involved. It's getting from here to there. And so the mental model that I have of strategy always involves movement. It's never satisfactory to stay where you are, to just stay the same. And in my mind, that helps me avoid getting into ruts.
I've really been helped think about strategy with Mancini's book, Church Unique, and thinking about it as a map. In the context of the church, we're disciples making disciples, and so where does someone go, and where do we want people who are connected to a church, to a faith-based group, where do we want them to go to grow in discipleship and help others grow in discipleship? And so Mancini uses that icon of a map or a flashlight of this is where we want somebody involved and somebody to go. Same idea, John, of action. But what would be important enough that we would say, out of all the things somebody could be doing, these are the things that we say, oh, go here and be part of this.
Okay, so that's good. That's helpful. So this idea of movement or going, I'm wondering, say a little more on one of you, or maybe it'll be me, but say a little more on maybe what that means and what that doesn't mean in terms of strategy.
I think using the Church Unique model, we have to remember that vision frame has mission on one side, values on the opposite side. Those are the vertical sides. And then we have strategy, which is a horizontal side, and then measures, which is another horizontal. And according to Mancini, those verticals, in other words, mission and values, will rarely change much. They may slightly, but those are pretty stationary. And the thing about strategy as a horizontal is that it's important to remember that the strategy has to take into account the mission of that unique church, which can do something better than 10,000 other churches. They are uniquely designed, gifted, equipped, called by God to do something that 10,000 other churches can't do that well. And the values of that church and the strategy has to incorporate both of those. And that's why action just for the sake of action or movement just for the sake of movement is not really good strategy.
Yeah. Or I think about another example of, so I work, in transition ministry, and so we're working with a congregation in transition, and part of the goal is to help that church navigate through that time and to come out stronger on the other end. And so we have a team of transition pastors, and the strategy is often quite similar in a transition. Lots of things can change within that strategy, and people will do it differently. But the strategy is typically you want to come in and you're going to build trust is the first thing you're going to do. You're going to assess ministry and get into action to move toward greater fruitfulness. And we sometimes talk about that smoothing the runway for the next chapter in ministry, and then on to facilitating a search process. So that's kind of our moving our way through. But within that, so every transition pastor does it a little differently, assesses a little differently, but the movement is there, and there is there's a real goal in mind here. It isn't just movement for the sake of movement. We're working toward how do we help our congregation lead into the next chapter.
I'd add one more component to that, which I know that you do, Scott, and is really has become, I think, more important in this really volatile, uncertain age that we're living in now, and that's defining who we are, what we are, where we are, because one of the common mistakes I see churches make and church leaders is that they put all kinds of effort into coming up with this great vision, and it's a very good vision. It's clear, it's compelling, it has enough certainty that people can see, yeah, we really should be there. But the problem is, if you're going to get somewhere, and the map is a great illustration of this, if you want to get somewhere, you have to know where you're starting from. Basic land navigation principle I learned in the Army: if you don't know where you are, you can't get to where you're trying to go. And so the very first step that churches need to learn when we're talking about strategy is to be very clear and and have a good understanding of who they are, where they are, and what they are. And that's one of the reasons we use Church Unique, of course, but any church entering into an empty pulpit situation or into a transition, that's one of the first things they need to work on.
Right. Yeah.
Well, let me ask a question. So I hear this a lot. We're doing this, we're strategically doing, X. This is part of our strategy. Here's my question, because I think the word strategy gets used a lot, because I use it a lot. I think a lot of us do. But I struggle a little bit with what is strategic and what's tactical. And I'm wondering if we can talk a little bit about, how prescriptive or how definitive do we have to be, or do we need to be, or should be, when we talk about strategy?
Let me start by starting a little bit farther out. There's a common misunderstanding between strategy and long-term planning. When we use the word strategic, what we're talking about is the longer-term, overarching process to get from here to there, and that can take a matter of months. It can take years. But strategic is different than long-term planning, because a long-term plan has one way to go. It has one route. A strategic plan incorporates various ways to get to where you're going based upon what happens at various points along the way. And we want to have strategic thinking, because there isn't just one way to get where you're going. For example, a church that has a vision of 10 years, and it's a good vision, and they start out with an understanding of who they are, but along the way, over the course of 10 years, multiple things change. The congregation changes, the circumstances change, and the culture changes. And with all of those changes, to assume that the original plan you had that's going to be effective for 10 years is probably wrong. And so strategic plan has to have the opportunity, has to have built-in ways of considering that there's another way to get to where we're going. So that's strategic in my mind. Tactical is simply the way that we accomplish the subcomponents or the objectives of that strategy. And there can be multiple lines, there can be multiple levels of that strategy. There can be a discipleship component, there can be a leadership component, there can be a cultural component, a values component, whatever.
So I've been hearing this term, and I've been studying a little bit on my own, contextual intelligence. That's kind of so we know about intelligence, we know about a little bit about emotional intelligence, contextual intelligence. And I think, John, what you're saying, Scott, some of what you said, I think that term applies very much to strategy that breathes and ebbs and flows and sometimes changes depending on what's happening around us. I mean, it's not lost on me that we're having this conversation. We envisioned Think Tank Thursday a long time ago, not as three guys on a screen, but in a room with a whiteboard with a camera. And that may yet come to fruition, but so contextual intelligence as it relates to strategy seems like it would be a pretty important thing.
I think it is an awareness. It's not just an individual awareness as a leader, but I think it's an awareness in an organization that things are changing. And that awareness is a great strength when we're talking about fulfilling our strategy or accomplishing our strategy. And the one component that I would want to point out is it's really important in awareness to understand what can change, or maybe what should change, and what cannot.
That would be important.
Very.
Oh, we lost
very.
that. See, I told you that we have no idea where this conversation is.
We scared Scott away.
We'll have three of us. But we're going to keep going. So,
yeah.
And hopefully Scott will come back. But John, maybe say a word on is to be strategic. Is that something you're born with, or is that something you can learn, or is it both?
I think it's both and, yeah. As an Army officer, I was a strategic intelligence officer. And all that means is that it means that you have a perspective that's global rather than just local. It means that you have a much bigger perspective. You're looking at how things interact and the big picture rather than just a small picture. You're looking at the forest, not the trees. And so I think there are people who are born with that tendency and with that ability, but everyone can develop more capacity and more ability to be a strategic thinker. Part of it is practice, part of it is learning, but I think the greatest benefit and the best way to learn to be a strategic thinker is to interact with groups of people who think differently. And that interaction, that mutual learning, kind of what the fifth discipline refers to as the learning organization, that is the great context for strategic thinking in my mind.
Yeah, I really appreciate that, because I think sometimes we have this idea that there are strategic thinkers and we need to defer to them because they're the strategists. there are visionaries, and we need to defer to them because they're the visionaries. There are people that are sort of operational and, actually get stuff done. And I think what you're saying is there's some truth to that, that there's some natural DNA, some giftedness, but there's also, we can collaborate and we're better together in terms of vision and strategy and how we get stuff done. I mean, it's both, right? I mean,
Absolutely. Absolutely. And then of course, in our Christian context, when we're talking about churches and we're talking about faith, the really important thing to remember is that the most strategic person in the room is not me, it's not you, it's the Holy Spirit. And the Holy Spirit has this ability to work through all of us to bring out something that's better than it would have been if it was just me. Doesn't matter how good a strategic thinker I am, the Holy Spirit is always better.
Scott Walters, welcome back to the conversation.
How about that? I got kicked out, so I'm trying to be adaptive here, but kicked me right off.
Wow.
Yeah.
I'm sorry to hear that.
All the best questions for you.
There you go.
No, we're just talking through here, just winding our way, thinking about strategy. Scott, maybe not to put you on the spot, but I guess I will. But is there can you point to any examples where strategy either came to the forefront and made a big difference in a church, or where there wasn't strategy and maybe the church didn't do so well? And without maybe naming churches you've served, because that might not go too good. But
yeah, I think obvious answer is it does really matter. Again, so much of my thinking currently is around the church unique model, and I'm just noticing. So if I think about my experience as an installed pastor, I didn't always pay that much attention to strategy and didn't invite others to really think and pray that through. And I'm just realizing in this whole idea of where are we and where are we going, that the value of just slowing down, and especially doing this with a group of people, and talking, thinking, praying, learning together, and just saying what you see. That there's value in an intentional process around that. Because otherwise, how do you know? Well, first of all, what are you going after, and how do you know if you hit the mark or not, if you're not paying attention to what you're actually doing and where you're trying to get? So that's not a specific example as much as just trying to share the value of let's really pay attention to this.
Yeah, I think that this is extremely helpful. So what I've heard, among other things, is you got to know where you're starting from. And Scott, what you kind of alluded to is you got to know where you're kind of going toward too. So maybe can we talk a little bit about how strategy interfaces with measures, what the relationship there is and why it matters? I said I had 3 questions. Apparently I got more like 30, but this is how these conversations go. So.
Well, I'd like to say something about how we practically implemented a strategy-based approach or a strategic approach in the church. I'll say this based on the fact that my first pastor was a complete disaster. I didn't have a clue what I was doing. It was not strategic. It was probably more people-pleasing than it was strategic and intentionally moving towards something. Good things happened, but it was more accidental than on purpose, and so I'm not sure where that counts. But the most transformational strategy that I was ever part of in a church is when we were willing to say that our leadership team meetings, our consistory meetings, when our elders and deacons got together, At first, when I arrived at the church, they were basically nothing more than business meetings. They were board meetings. But yeah, there was perfunctory prayer at the beginning and the end, but it was, you know, bodies, bucks, and bricks. And it was our decision to intentionally change how we did what we did. It was a tactical decision to change how we went about those meetings that created a strategic viewpoint. So what we decided to do was we were going to follow the biblical model of building community. And so rather than meeting once a month for a board meeting, the elders met one. And we talked about what was going on in our lives. And in building that community, the tactic of meeting once a week built community, which became the basis of a strategic process in the church. And so the community that was built in the church became the basis of our strategic outreach to the community. And so I would just suggest that it is sometimes strategy influences tactics and tactics influence strategy. But that was the most transformational thing we had ever done in the church. And it was the commitment to become a learning community. And that was the most strategically transformative thing we'd done. So
That's really good. I like that.
Well, I think we'll wrap it up because we don't want to go too long. We don't want to lose our viewers. Maybe we've lost some already. Hopefully not. But any last words from either of you as it relates to strategy in the church?
More than one way to do it. There is no one single strategy that works for every church. You know that, we know that. There are all kinds of ways to do it. Just make sure it's built on who you are.
And don't be afraid to try things. And, you know, intentionality is good. And you'll learn some things along the way. And I love John's idea of, in that sense, the strategy keeps changing. You're thinking strategically, but it does keep changing, and take some of the pressure off to get it perfect or right the first time.
Yep.
And I'll just add in one thing. In the church unique process, often, or really all the time, strategy gets represented by a picture, and that's intentional for all the reasons we've talked about. Because it doesn't need to be overly prescriptive. It can change. You don't need 200 words or 300 words to describe strategy. You need to show it, and then people need to be part of it, or you want them to be part of it. So we can say more. Part of what we do, hopefully you know this, but if you don't, you will now. As we here at Luminex, we do a lot of things. We exist to develop leaders to start and strengthen churches. And so part of what we do is we work with churches and we work with church leaders on processes like Church Unique, God Dreams, systems thinking for churches, and much more. So that's enough for today. Again, please give us your feedback. Tell us what we can do better. Give us some topics, all that good stuff. Thanks for listening. Hope your day is good.
See ya.
Yeah.